Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. A Symphony of Coincidences. The brisk autumn wind swept through the streets of Montreal, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts and the faint aroma of rain-soaked leaves. Amelia tightened her scarf and shoved her hands deeper into the pockets of her oversized coat, her fingers brushing against the book she'd picked up earlier. The Art of Coincidence. It was one of those obscure finds from a second-hand bookstore, its corners worn and its spine cracked, yet it had called to her, as if whispering secrets meant only for her. She glanced at her watch. 5:47 p.m. The sky had already surrendered to dusk, the city's lights painting golden patterns on the wet pavement. She was late, not that it mattered. The gallery opening was more of a favor to her best friend, Claire, who insisted Amelia needed to get out more. Amelia agreed only on the condition that Claire owed her 2 coffees and a promise never to drag her to an event like this again. As she approached the gallery, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. Her auburn curls were rebelliously untamed, and her green eyes bore a hint of skepticism. She sighed, pushing the door open. Warmth and chatter enveloped her as she stepped inside, her boots clicking softly on the polished floor. The room was a kaleidoscope of colors and voices. Paintings hung on white walls, their abstract forms daring viewers to decipher their meanings. Amelia felt like an imposter among the crowd of art enthusiasts, critics, and collectors. She made a beeline for the far corner, where a modest table held a selection of wine and hors d'oeuvres. If she was going to endure this, she might as well do it with a glass of something in hand. "Not a fan of the scene either?" a voice asked. She turned and found herself looking into the most peculiar pair of eyes she'd ever seen, one blue, the other gray, like the meeting of day and storm. The man before her was tall and wiry, with a tousled mop of dark hair that seemed perpetually windswept. His suit was slightly askew, his tie undone, as though he'd been dragged here against his will. "Not particularly," Amelia admitted. "You?" "Absolutely not," he said, his lips quirking into a half-smile. "But I promised a friend I'd make an appearance." She raised her glass in a mock toast. "Here's to reluctant promises." He clinked his empty glass against hers and chuckled. "I'm Oliver, by the way." "Amelia. Well, Amelia, since neither of us wants to be here, what do you say we make this more interesting?" His eyes sparkled with mischief. "Let's pretend we're art critics." Amelia laughed despite herself. "I don't know the first thing about art." "Perfect," Oliver said. "Neither do I." And so they wandered the gallery, inventing absurd interpretations for each piece they encountered. A red splatter became a metaphor for spilled ketchup on a heartbreakingly perfect hamburger. A tangled mass of lines symbolized the frustration of tangled headphones. Their laughter drew disapproving glances from a few serious attendees, but Amelia didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely at ease. As the evening wound down, Oliver walked her to the subway station. The city buzzed softly around them, the hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog filling the spaces between their words. When they reached the entrance, he hesitated. "Do you believe in fate, Amelia?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "That's a big question for a first meeting." He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Humor me." She considered for a moment. "I think coincidences are just life's way of keeping us on our toes. Like a cosmic nudge." Oliver smiled faintly. "Interesting perspective." Before she could ask what he meant, he slipped a card into her hand. "Call me if you ever want to unravel more ketchup metaphors." Amelia watched as he disappeared into the night, the streetlights casting elongated shadows in his wake. She glanced at the card. It was blank except for a phone number and a single line of text. Timing is everything. 3 weeks passed before she found the courage to call. The line rang once, twice, and then, "This number is no longer in service." Amelia frowned, her heart sinking. She flipped the card over, wondering if she'd missed something. In faint, almost invisible writing, another message appeared under the light. "Look for me at the corner of Crescent and Sherbrooke, November 20th, 8 p.m. The date was today. Heart pounding, she grabbed her coat and dashed out the door. She didn't know what she was expecting, a joke, a serendipitous meeting, or nothing at all. But when she reached the corner at precisely 8 p.m., she found only an old book propped against a lamppost. The Art of Coincidence. A note was tucked inside the cover. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones never told. Amelia looked around, the bustling city suddenly feeling unbearably still. And for the first time, she wondered if Oliver had been real at all, or if he was just a fleeting moment of magic, a symphony of coincidences she'd been destined to hear. Chapter 2. Shadows of a Ghost. The wind had a sharper bite that evening as Amelia walked back to her apartment, the book clutched tightly in her arms. The streets of Montreal, usually so familiar, now felt strange and surreal, as though the city itself was playing tricks on her. The note inside the book haunted her thoughts. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are the ones never told. Who was Oliver? Why had he chosen her for this peculiar game? And most importantly, was it even a game? Her apartment was a small but cozy sanctuary tucked away in a nondescript building on Saint-Urbain Street. The moment she closed the door behind her, the noise of the city faded, leaving only her racing thoughts. She tossed her coat onto a chair and set the book on the table, staring at it as if it might reveal its secrets if she looked hard enough. The cover was worn and faded, its title embossed in a faint gold that caught the light just so. The Art of Coincidence. She flipped through its yellowed pages, searching for clues. On the third page, she found something, a faint hand-drawn map in pencil, marked with an X. Her heart raced. The map depicted a part of the city she vaguely recognized, Parc La Fontaine. The X was near the center, by the old bandstand that was usually deserted this time of year. Scrawled beneath the map in the same handwriting as the note was a single word: midnight. Amelia glanced at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. She had just under an hour. By the time she arrived at Parc La Fontaine, the city had fallen into a quiet lull. The park was eerily empty, its pathways lit only by dim street lamps and the silvery glow of the moon. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air as she made her way to the bandstand, her footsteps crunching softly against the gravel. The bandstand loomed ahead, its once white paint peeling with age. For a moment it seemed empty, and doubt began to creep in. Maybe this was a wild goose chase. Maybe Oliver was just a figment of her imagination, an elaborate story her mind had conjured in a moment of loneliness. But then she saw it. A single red string tied to one of the posts, fluttering gently in the breeze. Attached to it was another note, pinned with a small silver clip. She pulled it free, her fingers trembling slightly. "You came. I hoped you would. Follow the string." The string stretched out into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. Amelia hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could turn back, forget this strange night and the stranger who had sparked it. Or she could follow the string and risk finding nothing. But her curiosity won out. She gripped the string and followed its path, winding through the park like Ariadne in her labyrinth. The world around her seemed to fade, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves and her own heartbeat. At last, the string ended at a bench near the edge of the pond. On the bench sat an old-fashioned cassette tape recorder. A pair of headphones rested beside it, their coiled cord neatly wrapped. Amelia picked it up and pressed play, her hands shaking. The tape hissed for a moment, and then Oliver's voice came through, warm and unmistakable. "Amelia, if you're hearing this, it means you've chosen to follow the trail. You've chosen to believe in the possibility of something extraordinary, and for that, I'm grateful." Her breath caught. "I know you must have questions about me, about all of this, and I wish I could answer them in person, but the truth is, I can't. Not yet." There was a pause, as if he were choosing his next words carefully. Sometimes life gives us moments that feel like dreams, so fleeting that we doubt they ever happened at all. But dreams have a way of leaving traces behind, echoes that linger, even when we wake. You're my echo, Amelia, and I hope, in some way, I can be yours too. The tape clicked, signaling the end of the recording. Amelia sat there, the silence around her deafening. Her fingers traced the edges of the recorder, as if hoping it might hold more answers. She glanced around, half expecting Oliver to step out from the shadows, a mischievous smile on his face. But the park remained empty, and then she saw it, etched into the wood of the bench, faint but unmistakable. The greatest love stories aren't bound by time. For the first time that night, Amelia felt a strange sense of calm, Oliver's presence lingered in the air, not as a ghost, but as a promise, a story that wasn't over yet. As she made her way home, the city felt different. The streets seemed alive with possibility, each corner a potential encounter, each shadow hiding a secret. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for certain: somewhere, somehow, Oliver was waiting, and she would find him. Chapter 3: A Meeting Out of Time. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into a novel. Amelia wasn't sure she was prepared to finish. Every moment carried the weight of possibility. The book, The Art of Coincidence, never left her side, as if it might suddenly reveal another clue. But there was nothing. No maps, no notes, no strings. Just a story etched into the silence, waiting for its next chapter to unfold. Life resumed its usual rhythm, or at least tried to. Amelia went to work, met friends, and pretended not to notice how the mundane felt unbearably hollow now. She'd had a taste of something extraordinary, and returning to normalcy felt like waking from a dream you desperately wanted to slip back into. It wasn't until the first snowfall of December that something changed. Amelia was on her way to a cafe near McGill University, the place Claire insisted made the best chai lattes in the city. The streets were blanketed in fresh snow, the kind that muffled the world and made everything feel softer. She walked briskly, her breath misting in the air when she heard a faint melody, a violin. The sound drifted through the cold, haunting, and beautiful, pulling her in like a thread. She followed it instinctively, weaving through the snow-dusted streets until she reached a small square she'd never noticed before. There, under a street lamp, stood a violinist. He played with his eyes closed, his dark hair falling over his face, the notes spiraling upward into the winter sky. The scene was so perfect it felt unreal, like a painting brought to life. Amelia froze. It was Oliver. Her heart raced as she took a step closer, her boots crunching in the snow. He didn't seem to notice her, lost in his music. She hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. What if he disappeared again, like smoke slipping through her fingers? But then he opened his eyes. He saw her. The violin's bow faltered for a fraction of a second, his expression flickering between surprise and something she couldn't quite place. Then he lowered the instrument, a small knowing smile tugging at his lips. "You came," he said softly. Amelia felt her breath hitch, 1,000 questions tumbling over each other in her mind. But all she could manage was, "I didn't know where else to go." He chuckled, the sound warm against the cold. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." "How could I?" she whispered. You disappeared." "I didn't disappear," Oliver said, stepping closer. "I was waiting." "For what?" "For you to believe." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Amelia frowned, the confusion and frustration of the past few weeks bubbling to the surface. "Believe in what? Fate? Coincidence? Some mysterious game you're playing?" Oliver tilted his head, his mismatched eyes studying her carefully. "Out in the impossible." Amelia shook her head, her frustration breaking through. "You can't just show up in someone's life, leave cryptic notes, and expect them to follow you blindly. I need answers, Oliver. Who are you? Why me? What is all of this?" He sighed, tucking his violin under his arm. "I owe you an explanation. But first, come with me." Before she could protest, he turned and began walking toward a narrow alleyway. Amelia hesitated for a moment, her instincts warring with her curiosity. But curiosity won, as it always did with Oliver. She followed him. The alley opened into another small square, this one almost completely hidden from the bustling streets. A single bench sat under a tree strung with fairy lights, their warm glow casting soft shadows on the snow. Oliver gestured for her to sit. "This place," he said, his voice low, "is where it all started." Amelia frowned. "Started?" He nodded, his gaze distant. "Do you remember the night we met at the gallery?" "Of course," she said. "How could I forget?" "That night," Oliver said slowly, "was the first time I've ever been seen." She blinked. "Seen? What are you talking about?" He hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to tell her. Finally he spoke. "Amelia, I'm not like you. I don't belong to the same world you do. I'm an echo." "An echo?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "A fragment of something that once was. I'm tied to moments, to places, to feelings. I exist where the threads of time and coincidence intertwine. And somehow, for reasons I don't fully understand, you found me. You anchored me." Amelia stared at him, her mind reeling. This is insane. I know, Oliver said, a sad smile playing on his lips. It doesn't make sense, but it's the truth. So what happens now? She asked, her voice trembling. Are you just going to disappear again? I don't want to, he said, his mismatched eyes meeting hers. But it's not up to me. My existence is fragile, bound to moments like this one. That's why I left clues, why I brought you here. I wanted you to see me, to remember me, before. Before what? Before he could answer, the air around them seemed to shift. The glow of the fairy lights dimmed, and a strange stillness settled over the square. Oliver's expression darkened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. It's happening, he murmured. What's happening? Amelia demanded, panic rising in her chest. He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. Amelia, listen to me. No matter what happens, remember this. The greatest love stories aren't bound by time. They exist beyond it. Oliver, stop. Before she could finish, the world around her seemed to ripple, and he was gone. Amelia sat alone on the bench, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The square was empty, the fairy lights extinguished, the snow falling silently around her. She clutched at the spot where his hand had been, the warmth of his touch already fading. And yet, as she looked down, she saw something glinting in the snow. A single silver key. It was attached to a small tag inscribed with one final message. The story isn't over yet. Chapter 4. The Key to Nowhere. Amelia stared at the key in her palm, its cold metal biting into her skin. The snowfall thickened, coating the world around her in a hushed blanket of white. She sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The story isn't over yet. The words on the tag echoed in her mind, a stubborn refrain she couldn't ignore. Finally, she slipped the key into her pocket, stood up, and began the long walk home. The key became an obsession. Over the next few days, Amelia examined it from every angle, running her fingers over its grooves and ridges, searching for any hint of what it might unlock. It was simple, unmarked except for the faint inscription of a number, 144. She scoured her apartment for locks it might fit, drawers, boxes, even a dusty old suitcase in the back of her closet. Nothing. She looked up addresses in Montreal with the number 144, wandering the streets with the key clutched tightly in her hand, but none of them seemed to hold any significance. Frustration mounted. She began to doubt herself, to wonder if this was all some elaborate joke or a figment of her imagination. But every time she considered giving up, she thought of Oliver, his mismatched eyes, his enigmatic smile, his final words. The story isn't over yet. It wasn't until the following Sunday that she found her next clue. Amelia was at her favorite cafe, nursing a latte and absent-mindedly flipping through The Art of Coincidence when a slip of paper fell out from between the pages. Her heart leapt as she picked it up. The note was handwritten in the same familiar script as before. Go to the old clock tower at the harbor. Midnight. Bring the key. Her pulse quickened. She knew the place well. The iconic tower stood at the edge of the old port, its face overlooking the river like a silent sentinel. That night she bundled up and made her way to the harbor. The city was quiet, the streets glistening with frost under the glow of streetlights. The clock tower loomed ahead, its hands frozen at 12 o'clock, a long-standing mystery that no one had ever managed to fix. Amelia climbed the narrow staircase inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the top, she emerged onto the observation deck, where the wind whipped her hair into a frenzy. She scanned the area, but there was no sign of Oliver. Then she saw it. A small lockbox sitting on the railing, its surface dusted with snow. Her breath caught. She pulled the key from her pocket, her hands trembling as she inserted it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the box clicked open. Inside was a stack of photographs. Amelia picked up the first one, her heart pounding. It was a picture of the bandstand at Parc La Fontaine, the same place where she had found the tape recorder. The next photo showed the bench where she'd found the silver key. Each photo was a piece of her journey, meticulously documented, but it was the final picture that made her gasp. It was of her. She was sitting on the bench, staring at the key in her hand. The photo was taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking it. It was her. "How?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the wind. Before she could process what she was seeing, she noticed something else in the box. Another note. Turn around. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned, and there he was. Oliver stood at the edge of the observation deck, his hands in his pockets, his dark hair tousled by the wind. He looked just as he had the first time she'd met him, impossibly familiar and heartbreakingly out of reach. "You found the key," he said, his voice carrying easily through the cold air. Amelia stepped closer, the photographs clutched tightly in her hand. "What is this? How do you have these pictures? How are you even here?" He smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I told you, Amelia, I'm an echo. I exist in the in-between spaces, moments that aren't bound by time or reason. These places, these clues, they're fragments of my story, and now they're part of yours." She shook her head, frustration and disbelief bubbling to the surface. "But why me? Why did you choose me?" "I didn't choose you," Oliver said softly. "You chose me. The moment you picked up that book, the moment you followed the string, the moment you believed, you brought me back." "For what?" she demanded, tears stinging her eyes. "To haunt me? To disappear again? To finish what was left undone," he said, stepping closer. Amelia's breath hitched as he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was warm, real, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," he whispered. "But this is as far as I can go." "No," she said, her voice breaking. "There has to be more. There has to be a way." "There isn't," Oliver said gently. "This is my story, Amelia, but yours is just beginning." Before she could protest, he leaned in and pressed a kiss to her forehead. It was brief, but it carried a weight that lingered long after he pulled away. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. And then, like the hands of the clock he stood beneath, Oliver froze. His form shimmered, becoming translucent, and then he was gone, nothing more than a wisp of light dissolving into the night. Amelia stood there, the photographs still in her hand, the key dangling from her pocket. The city stretched out below her, vast and indifferent. But in that moment, she felt something shift. Chapter 5. The Keeper of Stories. Amelia returned home that night with the photographs and the key, her mind racing. Oliver's disappearance left her with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. His final words echoed in her mind. "This is my story, but yours is just beginning." The next morning, she sat at her kitchen table, spreading the photographs out like puzzle pieces. Each image represented a moment they had shared, or rather, a moment she had followed his trail. But as she examined them more closely, a new detail caught her attention. In the corner of each photograph, faintly scribbled in pencil, was a sequence of numbers. They didn't align with dates, times, or anything immediately obvious. 144-32-9, 12-76-48, 83, 19-5. Amelia frowned, tapping her fingers on the table. They looked like coordinates, but when she tried to map them out, they didn't correspond to anything that made sense. After hours of frustration, she was ready to give up when she noticed something else, a pattern in the sequences. Each number corresponded to a page, line, and word in the art of coincidence. Grabbing the book, she flipped to the first sequence. 144-32-9, page 144, line 32, 1, word nust. The second, 12-76-48, page 12, line 76, word 48. The third, 83-19-5, page 83, line 19, word 5. Path. Her pulse quickened as the words formed a sentence. Trust the path. Was this another message from Oliver? Or something he had left behind, knowing she would find it? Either way, it was clear that she wasn't done following the trail. That evening, Amelia returned to the bench at Parc La Fontaine, where she'd first found the silver key. She sat there, the book on her lap, waiting for something to happen. The park was quiet, the winter air crisp and sharp. The snow on the ground reflected the soft glow of the street lamps, casting long shadows across the path. For a while, nothing happened. But then she heard it, a faint rustling, like the whisper of a turning page. She turned to see an old man standing a few feet away, dressed in a long coat and scarf. His face was weathered but kind, his eyes sharp and bright as though they carried 1,000 untold stories. "You've been busy," he said, his voice rich and melodic. Amelia blinked. "Excuse me?" The man nodded toward the book in her hands. It's not every day someone unlocks the secrets of the art of coincidence. Who are you? She asked, her grip tightening on the book. Someone who's been watching, he said, taking a step closer. My name is Elias. You could say I'm a keeper of stories like Oliver's. Like Oliver's? She repeated, her heart racing. What does that mean? Is he gone for good? Elias sighed, lowering himself onto the bench beside her. Oliver is unique, even among echoes. He existed at the edge of what we understand, between moments, between lives. You gave him something rare, a chance to complete his story, but his time here was always limited. So that's it? Amelia asked, her voice trembling. I just move on? Not exactly, Elias said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Oliver may be gone, but his story isn't, and neither is yours. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. This is for you. Amelia hesitated before taking it. The cover was embossed with the same swirling patterns that adorned the art of coincidence. What is this? A guide, Elias said, to help you understand the paths you'll walk. You see, Amelia, you've been chosen, not just by Oliver, but by the fabric of coincidence itself. There are others like him, echoes waiting to be found, stories waiting to be completed. And you're their anchor. Her breath caught. You mean there are more? Elias nodded. Oliver was the first, but there are countless others scattered across time and space. They need someone to help them find their endings, to give their stories meaning. Amelia stared at the journal, the weight of his words settling over her. Why me? Because you believed, Elias said simply. And because you have a gift, a way of seeing the world that most people overlook. You don't just follow the threads of coincidence, you weave them into something beautiful. For a long moment, Amelia sat in silence, her mind spinning with the enormity of what she just heard. Finally, she looked up at Elias. How do I start? He smiled. You already have. Elias stood, his coat billowing in the wind. Keep the key. It will guide you when the time comes. And remember, the greatest love stories aren't bound by time. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. Amelia sat there for a long time, clutching the journal and the key. The snow fell softly around her, and for the first time in weeks she felt a sense of calm. Oliver's story might be over, but hers was just beginning. Final chapter. A thread through time. Amelia's life transformed after her encounter with Elias. The journal he gave her became a constant companion, its pages filled with cryptic hints, maps, and stories that seemed to shift and change as she unraveled their meanings. Each entry led her to a new echo, a soul untethered from time, waiting for its story to be completed. Months turned into years, and her journey took her to places she'd only dreamed of. Ancient libraries, forgotten ruins, bustling cities, and quiet villages. Each encounter with an echo brought a new challenge, a new piece of the puzzle. But through it all, one thing remained constant. Oliver's key. The silver key hung on a chain around her neck, its weight a comforting reminder of where it all began. It never lost its luster, and though it had no lock to open anymore, Amelia knew its purpose was far from over. One crisp autumn morning, Amelia found herself in Paris, standing before a centuries-old bookstore along the Seine. The journal had led her here, its latest entry depicting an image of the shop's facade alongside a single word: convergence. She pushed open the door, the scent of aged paper and ink washing over her. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves crammed with books of every size and color. An elderly woman behind the counter greeted her with a warm smile. "Looking for something special?" the woman asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Maybe," Amelia said, glancing around. "I'm not entirely sure yet." The woman nodded knowingly and gestured to a spiral staircase at the back of the shop. "The second floor has the rarest finds. Perhaps you'll discover what you're seeking." Amelia climbed the creaking stairs, her heart pounding with anticipation. The upper level was smaller, quieter, filled with antique tomes and journals bound in leather. She wandered between the shelves until her eyes fell on a small, unassuming book tucked away in a corner. She pulled it out, her breath catching when she saw the title: The Art of Coincidence. It was the same book that had started her journey, but this copy was different. The edges of its pages were gilded, and its cover shimmered faintly in the dim light. As she opened it, she realized the pages were blank, except for the very last one. There, In Oliver's familiar handwriting was a single message. "Look behind you." Amelia turned slowly, her heart racing. Standing in the doorway was Oliver. Her breath caught as she took him in, his mismatched eyes, his disheveled hair, the lopsided smile she thought she'd never see again. He looked exactly as he had the night he disappeared, as though no time had passed at all. "Hello, Amelia," he said softly. She couldn't speak, tears welling in her eyes. "How?" Oliver stepped closer, his expression a mixture of joy and disbelief. "You brought me back." "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "You said you were gone, that your story was over." "I thought it was," he admitted, reaching for her hand. "But something changed. The threads of time, they don't work the way we think they do. Your belief, your journey, it rewrote the ending." Amelia stared at him, her mind racing. "Does this mean you're real? That you're staying this time?" "I'm as real as you are," Oliver said, his grip on her hand firm and steady. "And as for staying, that's up to us." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pulled him into an embrace, the warmth of his presence grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. "What happens now?" she whispered. Oliver smiled against her hair. "Now we write the next chapter, together." The silver key hanging from Amelia's neck glinted in the sunlight streaming through the shop's windows. It had found its purpose, not as an object to unlock doors, but as a reminder of the paths they'd taken, the echoes they'd mended, and the love that had defied time itself. Their story wasn't bound by coincidence anymore. It was theirs to create, one moment at a time. The end.